The Week in Review with David Davis. Hello, this is David Davis. Welcome to episode 6 of the Week in Review. I hope you enjoy what we have this week. It's from strikes to long-range space probes. The controversy of this week is the rail strike. What's it led to? Cancelled services, stations closed, people desperate to get to work, forced onto busy buses, or they can't get to work at all. And of course, in towns up and down the country and cities up and down the country, services cancelled because they can't get the employees in. I mean, whether you go to a restaurant or other services in the centre of town. So what should we do about this? Because it's a real problem now. If you've got trade unions negotiating with monopoly public sectors and they can't come to an outcome and they go on strike, the whole of the public are punished. There's an old saying, a public sector strike is a weapon with a worker at both ends. So how do we deal with this? Should we take away the right to strike, as some people say? Not really, because if we do that, that's the mechanism which for a century has actually delivered better wages for ordinary workers up and down the country. One possibility is something called pendulum arbitration, making both sides, if they can get no further in the negotiations, have somebody arbitrate. It's called pendulum arbitration or final offer arbitration, used in America for a lot of essential services in many states. What does this do? Well, the arbitrator can only pick one or the other offer. He picks the most reasonable. So there is a competition in being reasonable between the employer and the union, as against now, which is a competition of being unreasonable. If you have pendulum arbitration, and at the end of the day, the employer or indeed the government is unwilling to pay for the deal that the arbitrator picks, then the union can go on strike, but not until it's gone through a process to make sure both sides have tried to get the most reasonable outcome. In the last few months, there have been a couple of developments in AI, which have got implications for public sector use of AI. There have been both in games. I mean, one of them was a Sony-developed AI called Sophie, which played Gran Turismo against the best human players in the world. And guess what? It beat them after some practice. It's a black box AI. It learned how to do this, as it were, by itself. We don't really know the details of how it made its decisions. The other one was playing bridge, a different sort of game. Quite complicated. There have been AIs winning at chess and Go and so on. Bridge has to take into account all sorts of uncertainties. It too, after learning its way into the game, was able to beat most of the best players in the world, or some of the best players in the world. Now, the difference, however, is that the bridge game, Nukai I think it's called, the bridge game can explain how it made its decisions. It's a white box AI. It's able to explain why it did this, why it did that, what the analysis was. Now, think about using AI in public services, or even using AI in any service where you might have a legal challenge as to what the decision was. A artificial intelligence that can explain why it did what it was setting out to do is much more useful, much more capable, much more able to do things which need to be defended in public. That means that's the way AI has to go in the public sector in the future. Sometimes politicians and media get into the habit of talking about the cost of living in rather general terms. Actually, a better way of addressing it is to look at the specifics for real families, real households. So we estimate that the average family is spending £300 more on food this year. They're spending £700 more on energy, with another £1,000 to come in the autumn. They're spending £400 more on petrol, £100 more on clothing, £400 more on transport, £700 more on mortgages. At the same time, we estimate that the average family or the average household is getting about a £2,000 increase in wages, in earnings. It's more than outstripped by the costs increases I've just described, let alone all the other things that I haven't taken into account. So when the government looks at this, it ought to have a proper integrated strategy so that households can afford to cope with these increasing costs, which means the one thing we do control, the taxes we impose on them should be very limited. We shouldn't be increasing national insurance by £200. We shouldn't be imposing a freeze on the allowances, tax allowances that people have, so that over time they can make ends meet without demanding ridiculous pay increases at the same time. That's what the government should be doing, integrating its tax and inflation strategy to make it possible for ordinary families to get by. 44 years ago at Cape Canaveral in Florida, 2 Voyager probes were sent into space. NASA scientists planned for these 2 hunks of metal to last 4 years, capturing moons and planets along the way. Yet decades later, they're still sending back some incredible telemetry. In 40 years, we've had images of Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, our very own pale blue dot, Earth, and others. What I find incredible is that these machines, decades old and still working, have less memory than, I don't know, this mobile phone. Actually, a lot less than that. In fact, less than you have on the key fob of your car. Now, 14 billion miles from home, their time's coming to an end. But a thought for you. These machines, made by men and women of Earth over 40 years ago, will continue into the cosmos forevermore. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Week in Review. And you might be interested to know that I've recently launched an Instagram account about some of my other interests. They range from antique aviation to the countryside and nature. If you want to have a look at it, just click below.